So here's this man, he's also in isolation. And the text doesn't necessarily tell us that, but I'm telling you it does tell us that, because it tells us from the beginning he's a leper, which would have meant that he would have actually been totally socially estranged. And really what it largely also would have meant is that if he was going through town, he would have been yelling out, "Unclean, unclean," meaning don't come near me, you're going to get sick if you touch me. Don't come near me. Which means that he would have not been welcome to places of worship. He wouldn't have gone to your dinner party. He would not have been welcomed into the synagogue. He would not have been at Thanksgiving family gatherings. He would have lived his life in isolation and alone. There are a couple encouragements, I think, here for us. Okay? So Jesus in isolation, this man in isolation. Some of you, I have no question, no doubt in my mind, some of you feel very isolated. And maybe you feel isolated in some areas of your life and not others, but you feel very isolated. Maybe you've told others about that, and maybe you haven't, okay? Maybe you feel isolated in the political world. It's probably easy right now. Maybe you feel isolated in the church world. Maybe you feel isolated because you are single and you want to be married, or maybe you feel isolated because you're single and you don't want to be married, but your friends are, and that feels weird and strange, and you feel lonely in that. Maybe you feel isolated just because you have so many questions and doubts about God and faith in the world, and you're kind of like, I don't think others share these, feel these. But I think there's something incredibly encouraging in this text, in both these passages, and that God the Father meets with Jesus in his isolation, and Jesus meets with this man in his isolation. And actually, you could extrapolate this through Scripture, that it's actually often in our isolation and our hardship that God actually comes closest to us and nearest to us. It seems to be a theme in the Bible, that it's actually in the wild places, in the wilderness, that God comes and he ministers most closely to us. So one thing we see here is that God meets with the isolated and in the places of isolation, right? In the wilderness places. God often does meet us in the Eremons. And this is the 5th time it's mentioned in this chapter. We're supposed to highlight that. God's doing something in those places. And the truth is that many of you know that to be the case in your life. The other encouragement, though, is that this man comes to Jesus and he says, "If you're able." And Jesus is absolutely able. Right? In that isolated place, this man comes to Jesus and he's like, I've been isolated for so long. This guy's supposedly healing people. I think I'll just kind of go to him and wonder out loud with him. God, are you there? I feel so lonely, and I'm so estranged, and I'm weak. Maybe you could show up. If you're able, would you do this? And Jesus says, I'll take that. So maybe you need to receive some encouragement just to come to Jesus and say, if you're willing, would you meet me? Would you work on me? Would you work through me? So verse 40, again, sort of at the end, it says, "If you will, you can make me clean." And moved with pity, he stretched out his hand and touched him and said to him, "I will be clean." And then 42 says, "And immediately the leprosy left him, and he was made clean." Now you hear all that clean language, and the reason why this man lived in isolation and alone was because, quite frankly, it's because he would have been contagious. Okay, there's something going on there. And no one was supposed to touch him because, and he wasn't supposed to touch others because he wasn't supposed to spread the disease around. But there were also all these rules around this kind of thing in the Mosaic Law in the Old Testament. And if you had these certain kinds of diseases, you couldn't be around anyone and you were declared unclean, okay? These are these rituals of purification. So here's what would happen. If you're unclean and you touch somebody else or they touch you, that other person becomes unclean. That's how it worked. And here's the thing, right? Like it's like this. Somebody has a birthday party, and you find out that half the people at that birthday party are sick, and you're like, well, okay, my child's not sick yet, but that other kid was sick. You know what? I probably shouldn't send my kid over to that kid's house. Do you get what I mean? Like there's this kind of thing. You're like, okay, let's just make sure everybody's clean. And so you had to go to the priest So the priest goes, yeah, you're okay, go hang out with other people. It sounds initially weird to us to use kind of this language, but think of it as like an ancient medical practice in a way, for the good of the community, okay? Anyway, there's a detail here that I think is really worth pointing out to you. This man, it says this, and moved with pity, he, Jesus, stretched out his hand and touched him. Nobody was supposed to do that. You weren't supposed to do that. You would become unclean if you did that. But actually, that's not how it works with Jesus. The next chapter, Jesus tells us this: those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick, I came not to call the righteous, but sinners. And by which he's saying, I am the great physician. I'm the great healer. Jesus doesn't become unclean from touching something that's unclean. The purity rules, the rules of purification work that way in the Old Testament, but in Jesus, they're totally reversed. For everyone else, to touch this man would have made them unclean, but for Jesus, it's purity that's contagious, not impurity. It's cleanliness that's contagious, not uncleanliness. John Chrysostom, who's a great preacher in the 4th century, he's actually called Golden Tongue. That was his nickname. He was the Archbishop of Constantinople. He said, he did not simply say, I will be clean, but he also extended his hand and touched him. Why did he add the and touched of his hand? For no other reason, it seems to me, than that he might signify, but by this he has undone the hand of the law. Jesus is saying it's totally different with me. Totally different. See, Jesus invades the dark places, right? He invades the unclean places, the impurity of our world and of our sin, and he brings his light into the dark places. He brings his purity into the impure places. He brings his cleanliness into the unclean places. So this is sort of this first main point, right? This life with God point. And we see this devotion to the Father with Jesus himself. But then we also see this repeated for us in this man, coming to him, imploring him, kneeling before him. There's this communion with God that's taking place here. Jesus and the Father, and this man with Jesus. And we begin to see how this changes things. But I want you to see how in both of these stories, there's this outward movement that takes place. And it comes from this dwelling with God, okay? And that's the trajectory. It's the only trajectory.